welcome. You're at a historic spot, and I'm assuming most of you know the history of what happened to the Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor was bombed. This is a historic spot because in spite of this small community of only about 276 people of Japanese descent living on Bainbridge Island, and that's a small amount of people compared to major cities like Seattle or Los Angeles or San Francisco, but we were the first community to be exiled because of Pearl Harbor and the World War II. And so people wonder, why did they choose this small community to be the first to be taken away and imprisoned, actually? And nobody knows the exact reason, but probably one of the main reasons is because of Fort Ward, which was a remnant of World War I, and there was a secret operation going on in there. There was a leftover radio tower from World War I that was tall enough to intercept signals from Japan, and they were training people to intercept those signals and then transmit it on to Washington, D.C., and that was happening right here on Bainbridge, but it was a secret, and that's probably one of the reasons the government was concerned about people of Japanese descent living here. And one of the other reasons is the government knew there were 110,000 people living in the United States of Japanese descent. This is even before computers and Google and internet, but the government knew down to the smallest baby when they were born if they were Japanese, even of 1/16th blood. And they knew they were going to have to imprison 110,000 people. Where are they going to put them? I mean, they're going to have to construct prisons to house all these people. And they did have one place, in a place called Manzanar in California near the Mojave Desert, and it had a few barracks, army barracks there. And so that's probably one of the reasons they chose a small community. And so we were taken directly to Manzanar. And so there was an advantage to being the first to be incarcerated, and one was we went directly to Manzanar into army barracks, which wasn't anything great, but it was a whole lot better than the makeshift prisons that they made out of converted animal stalls, like the Puyallup Fairgrounds, where the Seattle and the Santa Anita racetracks where the California people went. And they were making rooms out of animal stalls. And the barracks weren't anything great, but it was a whole lot better than the animal stalls. The other advantage was we got a whole lot of press coverage. And that's why you see photos like this. These are photos from the Post-Intelligencer, which was a morning newspaper at the time. And the original ones are at the Museum of History and Industry in Seattle. So they also tell the story of what happened. And in those days, the ferry from Seattle made 2 stops where it comes in today, and then it came across the bay, and there was a dock right here. And so it made 2 stops, and this is where we were taken away. So you're at a historic spot, because the memorial now is at the exact same place where we were walking, just like this. And there's a larger photo like this at the Historical Museum, and I was a docent there, and we had a group of school children in, and I pointed myself out. I was 7, and that's me with the barrettes in my hair holding my little brother's hand. That's my mama holding my baby sister who was 9 months old. I was 7, my brother was 2, and I have a 5-year-old sister, but she's behind one of these other people. You see her picture and other pictures. But when I pointed myself out with a pointer at the museum, this grade school child said, "Oh, you're a historic artifact." See, that sounds so much more impressive than senior citizen or survivor. And so I like to say I'm a historic artifact. But anyway, so it's because of Frank and his 2 friends, Junko Harui, who's the Haruis and the Sekos, who started Bainbridge Gardens, the nursery, and the other friend was Don Nakata, the people who started Town and Country Market and Central Market. And those 3 young men were the ones who were leaders in our community, and they're the ones who said that the story should be told So they instrumental in having a photo exhibit of the history of the Japanese community on Bainbridge Island. And that photo exhibit went around to organizations and school groups, and they went and told the story of what happened. And I think it's because of that the idea for this memorial didn't start actually from our community. It began with the Interfaith Council of Churches of Kitsap County. And one of their leaders came to one of the Bainbridge Island Japanese American community and said, "Don't you think there should be a plaque or something that says what happened to commemorate or to at least state that this happened here on Bainbridge Island?" And so from that idea of a plaque expanded into this millions of dollar memorial, and I could tell more about that as we go down to the memorial, but it began with that idea. And I should tell you that there are people within our own community who did not like that idea. There were those, especially in the older generation, who said that this was a terrible thing that happened, but we rose above it, and we worked hard, and we are now doing well, and many of us are successful, and you bring this up again, then it'll just bring back all the old atrocities that they had been subjected to, the racism that they had. And they didn't like the idea of having something like this talked about so much, so publicly. And they called my brother Frank and Junko and Don the three angry young men. It sort of reminds me of the civil rights movement. It sounds exactly like that. So some things keep repeating themselves in history. But anyway, that's how this came to be. But I'll go in more about that, and I'll go over there under the pavilion. Oh, and I should tell you, this is now a part of the national park system. So this is a temporary housing for the part-time ranger that we have during the summer. And I think he's here Friday, Saturday, Sundays.
Yeah. That's what the website says anyway.
Yeah, okay.
So short people come in front. We're all slow.
I should tell you that I was born and raised on Bainbridge Island, and then we were incarcerated and came back, and then I went to college and got married and lived across on the mainland. And then when my husband and I retired, we moved back, and I went to my first meeting of the Japanese American community. And at this meeting, they're discussing raising $3 million for this. And I'm sitting there quietly because I'm brand new, and I'm really skeptical, because how are they going to raise $3 million when, well, at the time when I said there were 276 people of Japanese descent, the population of Bainbridge was about little over 3,000, so it was almost 10% was people of Japanese descent. Well, that's not anywhere near what the percentage is today or even back 20 years ago. And I thought, how are we going to raise $3 million? But I kept quiet. And besides that, I had been active in organizations in the greater Seattle area for nonprofits, and one of the things I hated the most was asking for money. And I thought, I'm not going to get... Well, anyway, to make a long story short, despite my skepticism, here it is. And it's because it wasn't just our community, immediate community, it was the entire community. Plus, I can't begin to tell you how much people donated huge amounts of money pro bono. And it was not just our immediate community, but it was the entire island and the nation. But anyway, here it is, just to repute what I thought we couldn't possibly do. And one of the first things that we accomplished was to get all this clear. This was all blackberries and alder, and the first phase was clearing it and making pathways and things. And the first structure was this structure, and it was constructed by the Timber Framers Guild. And they're a group of, I think there's a woman, but mostly men who look for places to practice their craft, which is the way that they've been building structures in Japan for hundreds of years. And I used to tell school children it's like Lincoln Logs, and they look blankly at me. But see, that's your senior citizen, so I could say like Lincoln Logs, but now I say it's like Legos. But see, they don't use any metal fasteners. And they just asked if they could practice their craft and construct this. We just had to house and feed them for 2 weeks. And so we gave them the okay. And this is yellow Alaskan cedar. And if you feel it's really smooth, they didn't use any sandpaper. They just used this fine, sharp lathe. And we watched them, and what they peeled off was translucent. It was so fine. But and it's now aged and is graying, but it was actually yellow. But anyway, this is one of the first structures. And so that was constructed. And these signs are all from the National Park Service, and it tells the history. And it says, "Coming to America." And I'll explain. People say, why were there such a high percentage of people of Japanese descent on Bainbridge Island anyway? And it was because of the Port Blakely lumber mill, which was considered the largest in the world at that time. And so there were a lot of people of Japanese descent who worked at the mill. They were married and had families and had their own village there. And actually that's what brought my grandfather, was the mill. And I always tell this story about my family because that's what I know. But my grandpa actually immigrated to San Francisco. It was the early 1900s. He was a bachelor, but he decided he needed a wife. So he sent away to his family, and they found a fifth cousin for him to marry. He had never met her before. And she was placed on a ship to San Francisco to be his bride. So she was like a picture bride. But this was 1906. And you know what happened in San Francisco in 1906. So the piers were all demolished, the city actually was, and the ship was diverted up here. And that's another thing, I do not know how Grandpa found his way up here, and I wish I asked more about the family, but I didn't. And I tell school children, if you have grandmas and grandpas, you talk to them and ask them about your family history, because I didn't, and I wish I had. But anyway, Grandpa found his way here and met his bride-to-be. And my mama was born in Seattle. She was the firstborn. And then they were working in Seattle. Then they went to work in Bellevue, which is a suburb, and that's where the second child was born. And while they were in Bellevue, he learned that there's better work and better pay at this lumber mill on Bainbridge Island, and that brought him to Bainbridge Island. And then the subsequent children were born here on Bainbridge Island. My Aunt Fumi, who's the ubiquitous photo of a woman holding the child in her arms, she was born actually in the house that I was born in too. Because then the mill eventually closed. And the Japanese there were many people, as I said, there were so many Japanese who worked at the mill. They had their own village. But when the mill closed, the Japanese did not form another village like that. Most of them became farmers, and they were all over the entire island, except not all of them became farmers. There were some entrepreneurs, like the Nakatas had a meat market. The Haruis and Sekos started their own plant nursery, and now the result of that is Town and Country and Bainbridge Gardens. But then the majority became farmers, and they were all over the island, and I think that's what made the island unusual, and that people got to know each other. It wasn't us and them kind of thing, because that's sort of a normal thing when people live together where they can understand each other and their culture. But then you have preconceived ideas about the people outside of the community, and the people outside the community have preconceived notions about the people. But when in reality, people are people are people. this was the going concern and was a big business. It wasn't just a mill, it was a shipyard and creosote. There was all these things happening right here on Bainbridge, and that's what made it unusual. And it was unusual because there were people, it wasn't just Japanese who came here to work. Ships are coming in from all over the world to buy the lumber, and many people, well, there were people from the Scandinavian countries who came to work specifically for the mill, and then other people who were on the ships from all these different countries. People jumped ship. It was early illegal immigration, I suppose. I don't know, but people didn't go back to their countries. They liked it, decided they would stay here. And so people were intermingling and working together. And I think that makes a big difference. And when you get to know each other, you're not so quick to judge and you realize people are people are people. So these pictures that tell this story about the American dream, and this is a picture of third and fourth grade class in 1927, and you could see how integrated it is with Japanese children intermingled with the Caucasian kids. And this shows Mr. and Mrs. Moji. This is the day we were taken away, March 30th, 1942, and they were childless, and the soldiers went to their farmhouse to pick them up, to bring them here. Everyone had to be here. Oh, I should point this. This is a map of the United States, and as I said, they didn't have places to incarcerate people, but eventually the government had 10 prison camps constructed. These stars show where the prison camps are, and this shows where we went, from Bainbridge Island to Manzanar, and eventually went to Minidoka, which is in Idaho. And that was the last camp that was constructed. And they were all located in the exact same kind of location, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a desert. And I think people wonder, why did Bainbridge Islanders go from Manzanar to Minidoka? And there's a story about that. But anyway, as more and more barracks were constructed in Manzanar, the people who were incarcerated in Los Angeles, and they were in the temporary housing at the animal stalls, at the racetracks, they were transferred and brought into Manzanar. And they were families from the big city. And their young people, especially second generation young people, were protesting what was happening. And so within the camps, the young people were organizing meetings protesting the incarceration. And not only that, their teenagers' sons were in gangs. And see, her Bainbridge Islanders were farmers and country folks, and our children weren't in gangs. And so these gangs, I mean, things just repeat themselves historically, but anyway, these gangs were having fights among themselves. They had funny haircuts, and they wore zoot suits with chains, and they dressed oddly. And anyway, that alarmed the parents of Bainbridge Island, but the thing that really alarmed them was the organizers had decided they're going to have a mass camp-wide gathering protesting the incarceration. And so they had this gathering, and everybody was there to gather. And this too sounds so familiar. At this gathering, supposedly turned into a riot, and the guards shot into the crowd, and 3 young Japanese young men were shot and killed. And that really alarmed the Bainbridge Islanders. And so they heard that Minidoka was constructed, and that's where the Seattle families were taken from Puyallup Fairgrounds. And many had family and friends from Seattle there. And so they petitioned, and I think with the help of the Woodwards, made arrangements to be transferred from Manzanar to Minidoka. And then I think they thought, oh, it's in Idaho, it's in the Northwest. It probably is a lot better than this desert. This shows an overview of how this shows Minidoka, but that's exactly the same kind of environment that all 10 of those camps were. And this shows Walt and Millie Woodward, and they were special because they owned the Bainbridge Review, and that was a daily newspaper here on Bainbridge Island. And Mary Woodward used to do this with me too, but she has since moved to Yakima to be close to live by her son. They editorialized from the very beginning that what was happening to us was unconstitutional and wrong, and these are not our enemies. These are our neighbors and friends. And they lost subscriptions because this island was not a perfect place, but they consistently editorialized that way when newspapers, major newspapers nationwide and all up and down the West Coast was clamoring to get the Japs out. And not only that, they had a high school senior who used to work for them after school, and he happened to be of Japanese descent. And so they brought Paul Otaki into their office and said, Paul, we're going to give you a promotion. You're not going to no longer be sweeping the floor or be our gopher, but you're going to be our star reporter from the camps. So when you get to camp, we want you to write and report to us news about what's happening to the families. And so he did, and they published it in the paper. Kay and Sam Nakao got married. Mr. Cora passed away. My Aunt Fumi had her baby. She was pregnant at the time. And all these things were published in the Bainbridge Review, and the Bainbridge Review was mailed to the people in the camp. So the community, I mean, people were writing letters individually to each other, to their friends, but the community itself, I mean, you think about it, every person in Seattle of Japanese descent was gone. And if you think about it, they took every person of Japanese descent was no longer in California. The entire state of California, Washington and Oregon, was those on the west side of the mountains, and even that small lower corner of Arizona. People were incarcerated if you were even 1/16 Japanese. But here on Bainbridge Island, people were kept in touch with what was happening to their friends. And then I think the other thing the Woodwards did was, it's hard to go against the crowd and so here is World War II, and everyone's worried and afraid. But here on Bainbridge Island, he made it okay for people to say, these are our friends, they can't be our enemy. I mean, usually it's hard to go against what everybody else is, but and this is a small island, and people were able to. And so I think that was also the reason why we were welcomed back. Because even after the war ended, people weren't welcomed home, even when the war was over. And this shows a graffiti that a family in Seattle found painted on their garage door. No Japs wanted. But see, here on Bainbridge, it said that the highest percentage of people returning to their homes after the war is here on Bainbridge Island. And I could tell you that because the other thing is, people ask if we were able to return to our home, and we were, and the majority of the people here on the island were able to. The reason if they couldn't is because they didn't own their property, they were just leasing it. And the reason people were leasing their homes is because at that time you could not own property if you're not a citizen of the United States. But in those days you could not become a naturalized citizen of the United States until 1952. I mean, people here of Japanese descent were working at the mill since the late 1800s. They were here from the late 1800s, and yet even if they wanted to become naturalized, they couldn't. And so they couldn't own property, but if your children are born here, then you're citizens. And so it said that there were many 10-year-old owners of property because their properties were in their children's names. And then I think there was one family who didn't pay their property tax, and so they lost their property. But I've since heard that the neighbors, Caucasian neighbors, said, oh, if we only knew that, we would have been glad to pay that for them. And so there's all these stories about neighbors helping each other, but in our case, it was the Filipino men who originally worked, well, my grandparents continued to work for my parents, and so when the war happened, and I should say that my father was arrested, and when you see the picture of the people being taken onto the ferry, there's not very many older men in that picture, and that's because many were already arrested immediately after Pearl Harbor happened. because the FBI went to all the homes, all up and down the west coast of every Japanese home, and arrested men of caliber, like Buddhist priests and leaders in the community. But here on Bainbridge Island, the FBI came and visited every Japanese farmhouse all at one time. And many of the farmers were arrested because, one, they weren't citizens. Two, they all owned rifles, because all farmers owned rifles at the time. It wasn't for self-defense, it was for food. And then the other thing was, became farmers, and to clear the land, to plant their crops, they had to get rid of these humongous stumps left over from old growth trees that were cut down. And those stumps were 6 and 8 feet in diameter. You couldn't dig them out. You couldn't have horses or oxen pull them out. And the irony is, the government issued leftover dynamite from World War I to help them clear the land. And what did the FBI find but rifles and dynamite? And that's enough to arrest them in case that they might be a danger. And so they were arrested even before March 2nd, March 30th. And so, but anyway, so my father was also taken away. And I remember they were imprisoned in a place in Missoula, Montana. And I remember Mama getting letters from my father. And when she'd hold up her letter to read, there'd be holes in it. And I remember saying, Mama, why does Daddy's letter have holes in it? And she said, oh, I guess there's some things I'm not supposed to read or know about. But he must have told her to have Felix Nardi, the Filipino man, move into our house and look after it while we were gone. And so that's what Felix did. And I remember as a child that Felix Nardi and Eulalia, his cousin, they were the head men who worked on the farm. And they were like family in a way, because they were my babysitters sometimes. And I remember once Felix saying, Mama, taking Lily to the store, because we lived around the corner from Bainbridge Gardens, is walking distance. And I remember Mama saying, don't buy her any ice cream or candy. And I remember coming back, and I'd have an ice cream cone in my hand. And the other thing I liked to do was go to the Filipino bunkhouse at their lunchtime, because then they were eating lunch, and I thought it was so nifty to see them eating lunch with their fingers. That's the Filipino utensil, is what I was told. But anyway, I get to taste some of their food, which was great. And so, anyway, but when the war was over, they did such a good job looking after our home that my parents gave Felix an acre of the property to him, and he built a house on it, and then he went to the Philippines and married Shoni and brought her back, and they lived in the house he built. And that's another thing I learned, that back in those days, the government did not allow single Filipino women to immigrate. They did not want them to procreate. That's why there were no Filipino single women around, and the Filipino men, many of them, there was a big contingency who worked on the Japanese farms, but then many of them ended up marrying Native American women who were coming down to work on the farms, and that's why there's so much marriages between them. And so now there's a whole community on Bainbridge called the Indopinos, because their marriages now have produced Indopino children. And so, I mean, there's a whole other story there, but anyway, so Felix and Shoni lived in this house, and they had children, and now I live in the house that my parents and my grandpa lived in, and Felix Jr. lives in the house that his father built, and we're still friends and neighbors, and so things go on. And then it was brought out to me, and I didn't even think about it, and I don't think anybody did, but someone brought up the Bataan Death March, and I thought, there's no love lost between Japanese and Filipinos because of what Japan did in the Philippines. But, you know, that just never entered my head until someone brought that up. And see, that just shows how when you get to know each other, you don't think about that, and you just become your friends. So in spite of terrible things happening, there's always bad, but there's always good too. And so that's what I think we should dwell upon. And we seem to always dwell upon the evil and the bad, but this island is a perfect example of where there was so much good that happened during that time rather than, it wasn't a perfect place, but there was so much good that happened here. I think the island pretty unusual in that way, and it's because it was small enough where people got to know each other. Anyway, we should go down to the wall and I could tell more about that. These are also signs from the National Park Service, and see, these are all photos from the Post Intelligencer. And well, this is my Aunt Fumi, and she was pregnant, and she's holding Natalie, my cousin, who was 13 months old at the time. And my Aunt Fumi said that the men made a crib for him out of leftover lumber. They made a box for the baby to sleep in. So that's what she told me. Because she used to, And this is Mr. and Mrs. Moji and the convoy truck where the soldiers came to pick them up to bring them here. And they didn't have a child, but they had a dog, King, and King jumped in to go with them. But they couldn't take King, and so they had to put him off. And the neighbors said, "Don't worry, we'll look after King for you." And then a few weeks later, they got a letter from their neighbors that said they were sorry, but King refused to eat or drink anything and passed away. I'm a survivor, but I was 7. I was a child. And so it's a whole different story when you hear it from someone who was 22 or even a teenager at the time. To me, people ask me, what did you think when you heard about Pearl Harbor? In those days, even 5-year-olds know what's going on in the big wide world today. But even at 7 or even at 12 years old, I don't think, we were so protected. We didn't have television. We had radios, but it wasn't, and I don't know, and I think even our parents weren't that worldly, I don't think. But anyway, that my mother said, Mr. Freelander called my mother and said, my father's name was also Frank, like my brother's. And Mr. Freelander said to my mother, Shigeko, did you hear from Frank? And my mother said, no. And he says, oh, I'm sorry to tell you, but the FBI came and arrested him. And so they arrested him straight out of the office at Freelander and Sons in Seattle. But anyway, the night before we're to come here to be taken away, Mama said, tomorrow we're going to take the ferry to Seattle. I was so excited. That was as if Mama said, we're going to Disneyland. Back in those days, a ferry to Seattle was a special thing. And I remember being so excited I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, and I asked school children, is that what you do? And she said, yes. But I remember that. And then when we got up in the morning, the Mama had things written in a suitcase and for me to carry, but she had this plaid coat that she wanted me to wear, and I didn't want to wear it. And so I'm having this big argument with Mom. No, I don't want to wear that. Well, see, that was really brought home to me when I had my own children and I had a kid who didn't want to wear it. But anyway, that's the kind of thing I remember of that day, and I had no idea that there was a war. And then when we got here, and the convoy truck didn't have to come get us because my father had a big black Buick sedan, and Felix Nardi drove us here in that. And anyway, but when we got here, and I think we picked up my cousins, so that's why we're all here. I saw all my, not only my cousins, but I saw the whole community here. It was as if it was a gathering for our big community picnic. Everybody was here, and it was so exciting. And then I saw soldiers with real guns. And then we got on the ferry, and then we got on a train. Never been on a train before, and so it was like fun and games for a 7-year-old. And so it's a whole different story when I think about the adults. They didn't know where they were going to be taken or if they could ever come back or see. Just imagine being told that you have to leave and you're leaving your home and everything, and you're only taking what you could carry. I mean, that to me, it's amazing that they all went cooperatively. But then when I heard, that's the other thing I learned from my mother's interview. She said, I didn't believe that the government would do anything bad to us. This was the United States, after all, she said. And she said, I felt like they were trying to protect us. And I thought, I wonder if that's how everybody else felt, you know. But anyway, so, but then the soldiers were young men from New Jersey. And I remember Kay Nakao talking about them, and she said they talked funny. They were from New Jersey, and they talked funny. But they were kind, and they were young, and they helped carry children, and they helped carry suitcases. And I think the Woodwards did interview them, and there is an article in the Bainbridge Review when they interviewed these young men, and they said they didn't know why they were doing what they were having to do, but they were following orders. And see, and I think my aunt said, she said, naturally we went quietly because they were carrying guns with spears on the end. And so, see, they did have bayonets on the ends of their guns. And so, anyway, and the other thing is, the Japanese American community, I mean nationwide, are working on is the power of words. And, you know, we use euphemisms to make things sound better than they are. I mean, you could say somebody has stick-to-itiveness instead of being stubborn. But see, here, this is all Japanese persons, both alien and non-alien, are to be evacuated from this area. And so when I ask school children why alien, they think, oh, it means somebody from Mars. Mm-hmm. But when you say non-alien, what does the government mean by non-alien? And when you say evacuated, when you're being evacuated, you're being evacuated from a possible dangerous place to someplace safer. But when you say, why did they say non-alien? Who are non-aliens? Citizens. And see, the government knew this was unconstitutional. They didn't dare write citizens, because then that would give them away. So they wrote non-alien. And see, that's pretty telling. And eventually they did admit, it took them 40 years, but the government did admit this was a gross misdemeanor. It was wrong, because at the end they didn't find one person of Japanese descent guilty of any treason or espionage. And a school child said that to me. He says, that would be stupid to be Japanese and be a spy during that time. Anyway, so that's this part, and then we could go down to where the wall.
Thought we were going to lose you over this.
Well, here you're at the wall, and it is 276 feet long. It's a foot for every person. But actually, just 226 people actually walked the walk to get on the ferry. And so people wonder, what happened to the other 50? Well, some of them were the men who were already arrested and taken away. And there were quite a few who were already in the armed services.
Some of them did join, didn't they?
Right, even before the war started, they were in the armed services. And then there were, I think, the Kitamoto brothers were going to Washington State, which is on the other side of the mountains. And there were quite a few who were visiting friends in Japan, and they couldn't get back here.
Oh.
And so that accounts for the 50. Anyway, so this wall is 276 feet long, and it's been designed by John Paul Jones. He was asked to be the designer, and he actually said, no, my background is Native American. But his wife, Marjorie, is the one who said, no, I think you should do it. And so it's thanks to Marjorie that he accepted this position. And and as I said, his background is Native American, and he's well-renowned architect. He's designed the Native American Museum at the Smithsonian Institute. He's worked with Maya Lin on parts of the Lewis and Clark Trail, and he's done several other museums and places all over the United States. And I think he got an award from President Obama as a special artist. And anyway, so he designed this, and he commands a large amount for his work, but he's donated every bit of his work and time pro bono, which is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the other thing is, we needed to get wetlands taken care of, and so a Corps of Engineers was here to look after that. And when he learned what this project was, he donated his time. The big cedar tree over there is called now a historic witness tree, because in the pictures of when we were taken away, there is a cedar tree there. And at that time, the shoreline, there wasn't a bank. It was a sloping shoreline over the years that has eroded into a embankment. And we were worried about that tree because the roots are beginning to be eroded. And so we asked Rudolph Ribeiro, he's a plant arborist. Anyway, he came to look and take care of it. He donated his time. And then we had landscape people come, and the Blodell Reserve gardeners donated their time to help us plant. I'm leaving out people, but and then we have the state legislature who supported this idea, so we got a $500,000 grant from the state. And so, see, here's the skeptic. And we got donations from everyone. I did a school group, and this little boy reached into his pocket and gave me $1, and he said, "This is from my allowance." I'm telling you, see, here I'm thinking, how are we going to raise $3 million? But here it is, and I come here and I just still think, oh, it says so much about this community. And John Paul said he made the walls curving because it's about life, and life is not going a straight line. And he wanted to make sure there was gravel so people can hear the footsteps going and walking along it. And then he placed pegs on the wall so people can place whatever they want to. But for some reason, people have assumed that it has to be origami cranes, which it only started because every March 30th we have an event here. On the significant, like the 50th, 60th, and 70th, we have a big to-do, but on the other years, we have actually a work party where we have people come and help us clean up around here and that sort of thing. But on the first significant one, John Boudet, who's now our project manager, he was the original timber framers, and when he got involved, then he got really involved, and now he's on our board, and now he's our project manager. But his wife made 1,000 cranes as part of this event, and so we hung those cranes. And from that, people made the assumption that only cranes should belong there. And so now people just bring cranes. They show up. Sometimes they're on trees and everywhere. And I think school kids made cranes and bring it here. And so it symbolizes peace. And I think it started with this young girl in Hiroshima. She was... I think, was she dying or she was ill from the result of the atomic bomb, and made 1,000 cranes, and from that the story has become nationally or internationally known, and somehow the cranes, so now I think at major events families make 1,000 cranes to commemorate special events and things, and so This is granite, and that's basalt down there. That's the stone you find in the desert. And then the next set of wall is a return. And so here was this beautiful wall that was constructed. And then John Paul said that the shape of the roof he based on pictures he saw of the strawberry packing sheds on the farms, and that was the pitch of the roof of the packing sheds on the strawberry farms, and that's what he based it on. When the timber framers approached us, they had different designs that we could choose from for that pavilion, and one of the designs had this pagoda-style roof that was blatantly Japanese. And then this one person, he was an architect from Portland, Oregon, who was instrumental in the memorial at the Portland Museum down there about the incarceration. And he happened to be visiting Seattle for some event, and Frank met him there and invited him to our meeting. And so at this meeting, we were discussing design choices for that. And when he saw that, he says, wait a minute, you don't want anything that is so blatantly Japanese, because this is not a Japanese memorial. It's an American memorial. It's an American happening, not something that happened in Japan. And so that brought us up short, and we thought, well, we don't want to deny our culture, but at the same time, he made a good point. And it was a good thing he did that, because there was a letter to the Bainbridge Review. There was a letter from someone who said, raising all this money for this memorial, the memorial should be built in Japan, not here. I mean, that's what he wrote. And so I thought, oh, this man was very wise. But yet we didn't want to deny our culture. And so with the compromises, we came up with a theme. When my brother kept saying, that was the other thing. Remember, I said there were people who did not want this brought up in such a big, blatant way. And so my brother always did these tours, and I never was involved with that part of it. But whenever he did the tours, he always said this memorial was not constructed to place blame or shame or guilt. That was not the purpose of this memorial at all. The purpose is to make sure it does not happen again to any other group, and to tell the story of how this community supported us and was so different from all the other communities all up and down the West Coast. And so the theme is, let it not happen again, and translated in Japanese is Nidoto nai yoni. And so that's our compromise. I mean, because after all, we are Japanese background, and can't deny that. And so anyway, so here's the wall is constructed, and I should tell you that we got this, the major amount what came from the state was this $500,000 grant that they granted us for this memorial. And it was at the height of the building boom, and all the bids came in at $1 million. We don't have $1 million, we have $500,000. And so we asked the state to postpone, and so we did that, I think, 2 years in a row, and then it was 2008. And you know what happened in 2008? And all the builders were clamoring for work. So they all came in at $500,000. And so we gave the contract to a local construction company. And so then the subcontractor was going to do the wood part of the wall. And he said, now tell me, what's this project about? And so when it was explained to him, he said, oh, those of us in this business have been keeping an eye on this 600-year-old cedar tree that a tsunami brought down, and it's buried in the sand on the coast of Washington. And we've all been eyeing it for a special project, and this is it. Wait a minute. We only have $500,000. We don't have any more extra. And he said, I'm going to do it on my dime because this is important. He had that tree excavated and milled, and every bit of this wall is from that 600-year-old cedar tree that a tsunami from Japan, mind you. And you look at this wood, it is pristine. I think I counted 3 places there's a knot hole. It's really remarkable. It's from that one tree. And so here's this beautiful wall with this beautiful wood, and then now we have to decide what to put on it. We had meetings, and all kinds of ideas, and you can just imagine. And so the design firm we had chosen said, wait a minute, this is not an interpretive wall, this is a memorial wall, and less is better. So you could just imagine how much. it took to decide what to leave out and what to put on, but we came up and decided it's going to tell the history in as short a way as possible, and we decided we would put every person's name on the wall, all 276, and the numbers after that names is the age we were the day we were taken away, and each tile is a family. It's in alphabetical order. If there's a crack in the tile, it does not mean a crack in the family. It's to accommodate the curve in the wall. And then we decided we're going to pick quotations from all the oral histories we've been taking of all the people. And so we chose different quotations, and then we chose a artist, Stephen Gardner, who works in terracotta, to illustrate the quotations. And so the 5 friezes are illustrating quotations. And so if you go down the wall, then you could read the quotations and see the illustrations, and you could see the names. And that's another thing a school child said, because there's numbers, and he saw 2 after, I think, my brother's name. He said, "How can you be a spy if you're 2 years old?" So I was 7, so this was 80-some years ago. So I'm 89 years old.
She just had a birthday.
I know, and our latest project is the deck, which is down there. We used to call it the dock, but you do not call it a dock, because if it goes even 1 inch over the water, there's all these ramifications, and we would not ever have gotten permit to even construct it. And so
it's deck.
it's called a deck. And so walk on down and read the quotations, because they're pretty telling too, and it tells.
Are they going to extend the deck a little?
No.
Oh no, that's it.
That's-
Okay, and that's why, because
That's why, because if it goes over the water, then there's all these different. I can't begin to tell you. So
all this stuff.
we had meetings and meetings and meetings about what to place on the deck, because we wanted to make sure that it conveyed how terrible it was. We didn't want people to have the deck as someplace wonderful to go out and see the wonderful view and see how a beautiful place this is. I mean, we wanted somehow for that deck to convey, when people walked on it, how the adults must have felt. I mean, just if I put myself in their place, I mean, I tell this story often too, but you know, Snow Falling on Cedars was a film that was filmed in Port Townsend, and many in our community were asked to be extras. And so we all sort of said, "Oh, sure, we'll be extras." And so the end of the day, the last shot was us carrying our empty suitcases and walking down to get on the ferry. That was the last shot of the day, and it was a long day. It started at 6 o'clock in the morning for wardrobe. All of us are dressed in our 40s outfits, and we're walking down the ramp to get on the ferry, and they said, "Cut!" Oh, something was wrong, so we had to trudge back up. And then we started again, and it must have been 5 takes. Finally, we actually got on the ferry. And so then we're all just laughing and talking, and then we look up, and the ferry is actually moving, and it's moving away from the dock. And I swear, all of us, I mean, we knew how awful it was, but all of us, I think, you know, were living and role-playing what the people actually, I mean, we saw the dock get smaller, and see, I thought, oh, I mean, it was my mama, and not seeing the island anymore, and you didn't know where you were going, and if you're going to ever get to come home again. And so somehow, when I was on the meetings deciding what to put on that deck, I wanted to make sure that somehow the artists would be able to convey how that must have felt for the adults. I mean, I said it was fun and games.
Right.
But see, it wasn't that way at all. And they went quietly and cooperatively, but I mean, just imagine how you feel if you have to leave your home and all your possessions, your pets, and you didn't know where you were going, or if you could even come home again. We had artists submit their ideas and told them what we wanted them to convey, and we felt they really got it. And so on either side are negative silhouettes of the soldiers with their rifles, and you can't always notice that, but they're on both sides. And at the very end are footprints of all different kinds of shoes and
sizes.
and sizes. So, every person wore a tag because every family had a number. And so I think one of the quotes is from one of the men who said he felt like a piece of luggage. 'Cause even the baby had a tag on with a family's number. So,
This baseball story is very, very. The high school, the high school were all, you saw pictures of high school students cutting out of class to come and say goodbye. Last week before the Exclusion, the baseball coach, they had a big rival game against Paulsbo that day, and he put all the Japanese players in the game, the whole game, and they lost miserably, 15-2. But nobody said anything. It was kind of his quiet way of protesting what was happening to them, and it was repeated in many, many ways in different times. The schools sent curriculum to Minidoka, and they took care of all the seniors and the students. And also remember that even if it was 10% of the community were Japanese, if you think about the kids, there was like 30% of the kids were Japanese in the class. And as a teacher, I think 30%, that's, then when you have a flu season, you can't do anything with with a third of the students gone. So it really impacted the schools a lot. And they were like the academic leaders as well. Many of the Japanese students were academic leaders. Paul Otaki was a ASB president, and so the schools really felt the loss. And
mold for these freezes are in storage just in case, and the storage is paid for by some unknown person pro bono. My two youngest, my sister passed away, my brother passed away, and so my sister and and she lives in East Bremerton, so sometimes she does this too. This was, I think, the 60th anniversary, and it was a big event. We had former Governor Locke here. We had state legislatures here. Every TV station was here. And we had speeches and speeches and speeches because the politicians were here. And the very last event was Ken Matsudara was going to read every name of every person of Japanese descent who lived here at that time, and there was going to be a moment of silence after he read the last name. And so he had the microphone and he started to read the names, and when he started to read the names, this murder of crows came and started cawing, caw, 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 so loud that you could hardly hear the names being read. And Clarence Moriwaki, who was the MC, was really concerned about that moment of silence afterwards, because He said, these friggin' crows. But anyway, when the last name was read, they flew away. That was the end of the event. The last of the event, we're all milling around, and Clarence says that this tribal elder came up to him and said, "Oh, Clarence, that was the most remarkable thing about those crows." And he said, "What do you mean? They were so loud you couldn't hear the names being read." And she said, "You don't understand. In our culture, crows and ravens are thought to be the spirits of our ancestors and departed. And many of the names being read were people who had passed away." And so sometimes when I'm telling this story, I crow. But anyway, he was skeptical, and so he called every television station and asked to see, "Oh, is that a crow?" See? Anyway, I've done an about face about crows after that. But he asked if he could see all their tapes, because, you know, they don't show everything, and they gave him every station let him look at all the uncut, all the tapes that they took of the event. And Clarence says that the only time those crows are cawing is when those names are being read. The only time.
Interesting.
It's interesting. And see, I'm telling you, 99% of the time I'm telling this story.
Why you start with the land acknowledgement, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is the witness cedar tree?
This one right here, this big tall one.
Looks like there are two of them together.
No, it's just one, but it's just how it's branched out. And if you wind yourself back up that way, there's plaques that quotations from President Reagan and Bill Clinton acknowledging that this was a terrible, big mistake. And see, not all governments admit to making a mistake, and it may have taken a long time, but our government did admit that this was a wrong. Once it was apologized, people felt that they could tell the story more. And then not only that, the younger generation kept prodding the elders to, "Why don't you tell us more about it?" And so then there's more and more books, more and more stories coming out, and et cetera, et cetera.
There's a full library of oral histories of the people. It was in the early 2000s, and we prodded, and especially the older gentlemen, they would not want to tell their story, and so we, it was Frank that finally got Akio Suematsu to say, "All right, I'll do it." But it, it's really remarkable now when you go back and listen to it, because you heard it, but then it's a whole different story again 10, 20 years later. It just has a different meaning, so it's really good to look at it.
Yeah. So, because the other story I like to tell on myself is my daughter was going to graduate school in Boston, and she needed a car. And our friends said, "Do not let her buy a used car on the East Coast because they have salt damage, so you got to get one here." And so my husband and I decided to deliver one to her. And so we're driving across country with this car, and we stop at a rest stop in the Midwest. And it's not like our rest stop. It's this humongous rest stop with every fast food restaurant you can imagine is in there. And so we're standing there, "Do you want Burger King or do you want McDonald's?" And we're deciding, and this family comes in, Caucasian family, and this little girl says, she points right at us and says, "Oh, look at the Chinaman." And I said, "Oh, Joe, we're not on the West Coast anymore." So then we get our food, eat it, and we walk outside. And soon as we walk out, I said, "Oh, Joe, look at the Amish," because here was his. Soon as I said that, I thought, here I'm an adult, and see. So that was pretty telling. So anyway, so that's the end of my tour.
Thank you, Lily.
You're welcome. So walk on the deck.
Great.